Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to the political education meeting for the Raleigh branch of Piedmont DSA. So just this morning I was reading about the new Prime Minister of Iceland, who is a woman that identifies as a democratic socialist and a feminist. She's an anti-militarist, and she wants to expand the healthcare system, surpass the Paris Accord, and make gender equality the status quo. And I thought, why the hell does Iceland have to be so cold? Here we are facing terrible precedents such as those unfolding just this morning, waiting to see what basic rights and freedoms will be stripped away from us tomorrow, witnessing the horror of the reemergence of racist white nationalism, and wondering what people can do. But our history has demonstrated that resistance is possible when enough people reach a critical mass and when they stand together and shout in unison, enough. So with that in mind, we're very lucky to have Logan Smith with us today as our speaker. Logan owns and operates the Twitter account at Yes You're Racist, an account he started 5 years ago. As a way of publicly shaming those who tweeted thoughts that typically began with, "I'm not racist," but this year he gained national prominence after the events in Charlottesville by exposing white supremacists participating in the hate rallies that weekend. Since then, he has gained over 400,000 followers on Twitter, many of whom contact him with the personal details of individuals whose photos are posted on the feed. While the majority of the feedback on Logan's efforts has been positive, he has received a large amount of criticism, most of it in the form of vile rebukes and in some cases threats towards him and his family. He has shown a great deal of courage and conviction in the face of the rising tide of white supremacy facing our country, and we are honored to hear from him today. So without further ado, I'll give you Logan Smith.
Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you to Charles and the Piedmont DSA for having me. My name is Logan Smith, and by day I work as the Communications Director for Progress North Carolina. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, we're a nonprofit who we work on a lot of different issues in North Carolina, public education, the environment, healthcare, that sort of thing, and we've been working quite a bit on this tax bill that unfortunately looks like it is headed to pass. But I suspect that you're here because of my extracurricular activities, and as Charles mentioned, I run the Twitter account Yes You're Racist. Before we get started, I hope that we can all agree. This is a friendly audience, I'm sure, but I hope that we can agree on some shared values. Number one, racial justice is an ongoing practice, not a destination. You don't just one day become woke and then are exempt from self-questioning and then just examining yourself and your biases and all that sort of thing, myself included. Number two, in our country, unfortunately right now, white supremacy is the status quo. It has been the status quo for the last 400 years, and it's not going to change unless it is actively challenged. When it comes to racism and all types of bigotry and oppression, there's no neutral path. You are either actively fighting against it, or you are passively or actively part of the problem. And number three, at least in this room, I hope that we can all respect other people, even if we don't respect individual beliefs. I'd love to have an open, honest dialogue, and that goes both ways. If you think that I'm full of shit on something, feel free to respectfully let me know why, and we can have that discussion. Does that sound good for everyone? Awesome. So I suspect that I'm probably not the first person you would expect to be running the most popular anti-racist Twitter account, one of the most at least in the country. And so just to start, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on myself and talk about how I got here and how that influences my work. So I come from a town called Oak Ridge, Tennessee. It's right outside Knoxville, and for those of you who have heard about it, you probably are aware that it was part of the Manhattan Project back during World War II. They enriched the uranium and plutonium and all that for the atomic bomb, which makes things a little bit awkward for the anti-militarists on Hiroshima Day, because on one hand it's like, we did this, we ended World War II, our town was part of history, and on the other hand it's like, well, we did this. So Oak Ridge is one of the only cities that I know of that was designed, built, and populated entirely by the federal government. And it was over the course of about a year or so. They went from a couple thousand East Tennessee hillbillies to a bustling city of over 50,000. But the unfortunate part of that is that because this was the 1940s, it's the only city that I know of that was designed, built, and populated by the federal government specifically to be racially segregated. And as a result of that, the white families had houses like this. If you're unable to see, the slide presentation isn't super critical, but you're welcome to move up. Anyway, so the white families were living in, nice little modular houses like this, but the black families, they got houses like this. Obviously no running water. The only heat was from a coal stove, and it's really just night and day. Now, fortunately, these houses no longer exist. Some of the other houses are still present, but the most unfortunate thing is that the geographic and social segregation in many ways still exists today. There's absolutely a black part of town and a white part of town, as many cities are, but this one was created by the federal government. And so, as a result of the geographic segregation in my hometown, I did not really live around, I didn't really grow up around many non-white people. There were not many non-white people in my class, and most of my friends were white. The other issue in growing up in Oak Ridge is that, and Charles may be a little bit familiar with this as a social studies teacher, but the social studies and history classes are kind of divided up into units where you start with the New World and Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II, and all that, and then usually we would get to the Civil Rights era, but then by that time school year ends and we all go home, forget about history class, and as a result, the Civil Rights era was kind of presented, intentionally or not, as being like the end of history. And there was not a single class that I ever took that got past Nixon, Vietnam. And so for me, when I went to college in the fall of 2005 at the University of South Carolina, which was the first year that this guy was the head football coach there. Go Cox. But as a result, I didn't really know that racism was still a thing, specifically institutional racism. Just nobody had bothered to tell me about this. And so, at a college like University of South Carolina, well, if you go there not really being clear on racism, you'll either leave still not knowing about it, or you will be very aware of that. And my awakening, as it were, happened on it began on September 2nd, 2005. Does anybody know what happened that day? So, everybody remembers Hurricane Katrina. Most specifically, this happened. And when it's hard to remember now, but when this happened, this was before Kanye West was Kanye, and when he got up there and said George Bush doesn't care about black people and freaked Mike Myers out quite a bit. Honestly, I thought it was kind of hilarious because it was just, another one of those wacky pop culture memes, I guess, before, memes were even really popular. But what is this guy talking about? I had no idea. But as as the crisis in New Orleans continued, we started to see stuff like white people who were looting grocery stores and that sort of thing were treated in the news as just people finding food during this disaster, whereas black people who were doing the exact same thing were referred to as looters. And as we saw photos of just frankly the criminal negligence of our government in addressing this catastrophe, it just became more and more clear that maybe this Kanye guy knows what he's talking about. And unfortunately, this sort of thing is still happening. Look at Puerto Rico; it's happening right now. And when a hurricane hits Houston, FEMA's there yesterday, but half of Puerto Rico is still without electricity and running water. And whereas all of the cleanup costs in quote unquote American cities are covered by the federal government, in Puerto Rico, which is an American territory, the government says, well, we'll give you a loan, and it's once again just night and day. And so I started to notice this sort of thing, and once you see the discrimination and the double standards that are a part of everyday life for many people in our country, it's really hard to unsee that. And noticing things like in Colombia, where the Confederate flag flew right outside the State House on the front lawn, right along one of the most the busiest streets in Colombia. Main Street ended at this flag. This was the intersection of Main Street and Government in South Carolina. Thankfully, this flag is no longer here, thanks in part by a woman of color who took it upon herself to take it down. And another thing that I noticed was that the Horseshoe, which is the most historic original area of the university, I guess the NC State equivalent would be the Brickyard, or the main quad, I guess. All of the original buildings were built by slaves, and the president's house, beautiful house on the Horseshoe, has this little nondescript 2-story brick building behind it that I walk to pretty much every single day, or walk past pretty much every single day on my way to class. Did not find out until later that it was slave quarters. None of this is on any plaque in Columbia. They don't. The tour guide conveniently forgot to mention this during orientation, and that's intentional too, because we don't like to think about the atrocities that our society and frankly our ancestors committed in the past, and that is just an example of the whitewashing of history. But at least for me, and I think to a lot of people, white people who grew up in an environment like mine, sheltered from the realities of racism and discrimination in our country, understanding institutional racism, structural racism, is a little bit like the arrow in the FedEx logo. Has anybody not noticed the arrow before? Okay, there's always one person, and it's to those of us who have seen it or know about it, it's it's obvious. It's right there. How could you not see it? But still, people can go years, their entire lives, without noticing what is right there in front of them. And sometimes it just takes someone to tell you that and to make it clear that this is a thing. This is right. It's right here, and which so that brings me to the first takeaway that I have here. If you see something, say something. Now we're all probably familiar with this phrase if you've ridden a subway or been in an airport, but I think that it kind of, to me, exhibits the importance of unleashing your inner Kanye, so to speak. And if there is, if you witness an act of bigotry or discrimination, it is on you. It is on everyone to say something. If it's, a lot of times people think that, well, I'm with my peers. This is a white, all my white friends, and if I tell a racist joke or just make a comment that we're all, none of us are going to be offended, but it is up to us to be offended, because and in many ways I think this message coming from a peer or your best friend can have that impact on you and really make you self-examine and change. And if that person doesn't self-examine or change, then do you really want to be friends with them? So I think that we all the main takeaway, or the number one takeaway I have, is that we all have to stand up whenever we see an act of oppression, because, like I said, there is no neutral path. So that was in 2005, 2006. Fast forward to 2012. We do have a black president, but surprise, America is not a post-racial society. You don't hear people asking that question anymore, do you? But so I'm just sitting at my computer around October 2012. It's a month before the election. President Obama is running for re-election, and to me the racist attacks against him were just like nothing I had ever witnessed before. Case in point. We all remember the birther movement led by our now president. But so I'm just sitting at my computer, messing around on Twitter. Sometimes I like to type in just silly little phrases in the search box, see what pops up, see what dumb tweets I can find, and one day I just type in the phrase "not racist but," and you would not believe the kind of crap that turned up. Stuff like, "I am not racist, but I hate Arabs," or "not to be racist, but black people ruined the USA." How could this stuff not be racist? How could you type this and not think that it's racist. And so that told me that, number one, either, a lot of people are just kidding themselves, or a lot of people just don't know what racism is. And I knew immediately that I had to make this a thing. And so I set up the Yes You're Racist account. Within 24 hours, it was up to about 20,000 followers, and I had already done an interview with CNN, which, was, I expected it would be popular, but I had no idea how popular. And this was, first 24 hours. So this Twitter account kind of started as more of a, I guess, lighthearted, if such a topic could ever be lighthearted, way of pointing out just the sheer idiocy of, people who think saying something like, I'm not racist, but this is why I hate a majority of blacks. The sheer idiocy of somebody who could think that isn't racist, but also to highlight the prevalence of casual racism online. And if social media is a reflection of our society, the casual racism in our community. Now, unfortunately, over the past few years, the situation involving race in America, in my opinion, has deteriorated even further. Case in point. And seeing Donald Trump ride to the presidency on a wave of open hatred, it just really it takes me back. I'm taken aback by that. And so over the past few years, my Twitter account has kind of evolved into more focusing on institutional racism as a whole, and the bigotry that is prevalent in, unfortunately, our government now. And it's it's a lot harder to chuckle at some 16-year-old dumbass who says I'm not racist but Asian people can't drive, when you have a literal white supremacist in the Oval Office. And all of that came to a head in August during the Charlottesville riots. Seeing photos of the torch marches and people Sieg Heiling, shouting, you will not replace us, which, takes me back as somebody who cares about history to Nazi Germany, with people, a bunch of white people carrying torches, Sieg Heiling, and yelling the German translation of "You will not replace us." This stuff is an intentional throwback to a very horrifying time period. And the next day, people just carrying Nazi flags around, people walking around in KKK robes. And the thing that really struck me, two things. Number one, these people aren't afraid anymore. They're not hiding. They're not, they may wear their robes, but they're not hiding their faces. They're out and they're proud. The second thing that I noticed was that these torches did a fantastic job of lighting everyone's faces in these photos. And so I took it upon myself when I saw, just these shocking photos coming out of Charlottesville, to, I told myself, well, these people are clearly proud to be there. They're proud of their beliefs. They're proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with literal Nazis and KKK members. And so if they're so proud of their beliefs, then you would think that they would be proud to that people would know that they have these beliefs. And I just want to help them, help their community members know who these people are. And so I posted on Twitter. This was on a I believe it was on a Saturday, and I just posted, if you recognize any of the Nazis marching in Charlottesville, send me their names and profiles, and I'll make them famous with the hashtag #GoodNightAltRight. And I posted several of the photos that were going around, and immediately I was swarmed by messages from people. Like within 5 minutes, I started hearing from people saying, this guy, I had a college class with him. That guy was, I went to high school with him. This is a well-known white supremacist in my area. This person was at the racist riots in Berkeley a couple months back. And it's too small to see, but this first tweet that I posted got 66,000 retweets, which, again, just like when I created the account, I figured it was going to be popular, but I just had no idea the response, which is a good thing, I think. And so this kid, Peter Svetanovic, was one of the people that I identified. He's a student at a university in Nevada, and I actually even found a photo of him with U.S. Senator Dean Heller. So if you think that these people are some fringe element, I promise you they're not. These are the young Republicans of today, but unfortunately, these conservative organizations, which in the past have been very mainstream, have been infiltrated and really taken over by a much more dangerous element. And the coverage was phenomenal in both the just sheer amount of it, and also at first the positivity. The Monday after all of this happened, I wake up to 2 voicemails from 2 different French media outlets who wanted to interview me. I actually lost track of the number of interviews I did that day, and in the afternoon, once the snowball kept growing, and once the local media heard about it, I had reporters literally, not figuratively, literally lining up at my office to interview me. But we all know how the news cycle works around here. First something happens, then there's the backlash to that thing, then there's the backlash to the backlash. Sometimes you just get even more backlash, so it's just backlash all the way down. And the question that started being asked by some of these news outlets who just try to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian is being a white supremacist grounds for firing? And the answer, of course, is yes. If you're a business owner and you see one of your employees on the 5 o'clock news, saying Heil Hitler and waving Nazi flags, well, then you absolutely have the prerogative to fire that person. Which leads me to my next takeaway. Freedom of speech is not freedom from criticism. Freedom works both ways. You have the freedom to go, dress up in your KKK robes and your Game of Thrones cosplay costumes and, wave your tiki torches around and say how much you hate Jews and blacks, but everyone else has the freedom to tell you that you're an asshole. And so, the people who, like this Peter Svitanovic guy was, just did a couple interviews where he's just so aggrieved and said, I just want people to know that I'm not the angry racist that you think I am. Well, buddy, if you didn't want to be pictured at a Nazi rally, you could have just not gone to the Nazi rally. And so the other thing, that happened with all this is that I started getting death threats. My Twitter account, my identity was published by these white supremacists and neo-Nazis. My identity's never been a secret. I, did that CNN interview the very first day I started the account under my full name. I've written op-eds under my real name, so it was never a secret. But whereas I just posted the name of some of these people, exactly what newspapers do when photographer takes a photo at an event and they try their best to get the names of the people who are in the photo. That's how it works. But in my case, they went much further, published my address, my phone number, my family's addresses, and immediately began a campaign of harassment and death threats against us. They even targeted my wife's grandmother, and so for people who say that you were doxing Nazis, so it's only fair to be doxed yourself. Frankly, I think that there's a world of difference between what I was doing and what happened to me. But I knew from the start that this is how they operate. This is what they've done, going back to the 16, 17, 1800s. They want people to be afraid to speak out. And when people do start speaking out, they engage in harassment and intimidation. And while we were getting these calls, it's tough. It's tough to have people, calling you on your cell phone saying they're going to rape your family. But I knew that the ultimate goal of these people was to get me to stop. And if I was going to sit down and shut up out of fear of violence from these people, they win. And I'll be damned if I help them win. That day that everything was happening, I was really conflicted about doing interviews with the media because that's just prolonging the story, and so my family was not really getting much harassment, but my in-laws, who are Jewish, were, which that should tell you something right there. And I messaged them in the morning and said I've been getting a lot of media requests. I don't know if I want to do it. I don't want to do anything that will make you all uncomfortable. I mean, these are my in-laws immigrated here from Iran, and they have experienced this sort of thing in the past. And so I said, if you don't want me to do interviews, I won't do it. And my father-in-law wrote back and said, give him hell, Logan. And that was just, I knew, number one, that I married into a very special and wonderful family. And number two, that, I had to continue. And thankfully, the response was 90% positive. And I was just frankly overwhelmed with people saying, thank you, Logan, for what you're doing. Keep it up. How can I help? And, really, I don't know if anybody has ever had a tweet go viral, but if your phone actually starts glitching out, like the Twitter app, it's tough to even scroll through, and I just was overwhelmed, literally overwhelmed. My phone, stopped working pretty much because I was just getting so many supportive messages, and so that's that was a really good and meaningful thing to me, that helped me. Keep going, but it had a real world effect, I think, because you may remember that shortly after the Charlottesville riots, the same group of people, Richard Spencer and all of his assholes, decided that they were going to come to Charlotte and have yet another torch march in December. But because people were, no longer afraid, I think, I think that Charlottesville was a real turning point, and especially because of the death of the young woman Heather Heyer, who was a member of International Workers of the World. I think that people started to see who these people really are, and decided that they can call themselves alt-right, but we know that they are white supremacists. Alt-right, really just alt-white. And the backlash against this the planned Charlotte event was so strong that within a couple days, people, they decided to cancel. Richard Spencer said he, was concerned about his safety, to which I said, good. You should not be able to come into our community and spout hatred and just leave without a care in the world. Which brings me to my third takeaway. It's on us. All of us. Everyone has a responsibility to stand up to bigotry, like I said earlier. But I think that, white people in particular have a responsibility because, number one, we have the privilege of not having to experience the microaggressions and bigotry ourselves when we fight back. But we also have a history, and I know that none of the people in this room were involved in the slave trade or Jim Crow laws or anything like that, but our parents' generation was, our grandparents' generation was, and they did not, while strides have been made, certainly, and we can all be proud of that, we still have a lot to go, and a long ways to go. And if we, all of us, do not stand up and, speak out, fight back, then we are complicit. We're just as bad as the people who were involved in the slave trade or Jim Crow laws or the racial gerrymandering and voter ID laws that are happening right now. So there are ways to fight back. And I know that that DSA has been very involved in that fight, and so that is why I'm very happy to be here and share this with you, because I know that the people in this room are we're doing what we can, but we have to keep doing it. So are